Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're really pleased to have this gathering, a very special gathering, which many people have said they've been looking forward to for a long time without knowing what exactly they were looking forward to. But I think it's going to be, I can promise you, a variety show. There'll be something for everybody. And we want to think about all different ways of sharing music across borders. Our title is, of course, the grand title, Music Without Borders, Armenians and Their Neighbors, Acoustic Connections Across Time and Space. And that covers a lot of territory, only some of which we'll be looking at tonight. It's my job to tell you that you're going to be on mute throughout the presentations. Then we'll have questions and conversation afterwards. It is being recorded. So if for any reason you don't want your image to be on the recording, please use the little thing in the left, well, my left-hand corner anyway, to black out your image. And there we go. We will be continuing over tomorrow, as you know, from 1 o'clock London time until into the evening. So we hope that you'll be coming back again. I'll say a word about that again later on. I just want to add that this has been organized by the Armenian Institute with the music department of King's College London. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our person from King's College London, who is Martin Stokes, whom many of you, some of you are even studied with Martin. So Martin is the King Edward Professor of Music at King's College London, also a Leverhulme Scholar, Senior Research Fellow, and a Fellow of the British Academy. His research, as many of you know, crosses Europe and also the Middle East, and especially in Turkey, focusing on Turkey and Egypt. He has a number of publications, of course, one of them being The Republic of Love, Cultural Intimacy in Turkish Popular Culture. I'm going to turn over to Martin because we have a lot to cover tonight, and Martin, take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, my own thanks to the Armenian Institute here in London and to the music department at King's for helping us put this together, and particularly thanks to Susan, who it's been great fun to work with. Just the other day I was saying, gosh, this conference has come together so quickly, hasn't it? We've just been working on it a month or so, and it's all fallen together just magically. And Susan looked at me and said, "What do you mean a month? We've been working on this for the best part of a year." I'm clearly the kind of person who managed to make months seems like years, and Susan is clearly the kind of person who managed to do exactly the opposite. Thanks very much to the participants for all agreeing so quickly and so happily to participate. Our participants really are huge experts in their fields, and it's just a privilege to have them together sharing that expertise and their thinking about how these Armenian musical worlds and these worlds' neighbours might be connected. I'm reluctant to extend a word of thanks to the virus, but it's kind of helped in a way, because from the outset we were able to think about something that would be partly networked and partly taking place here in London, and as a result of that we've got contributors and participants. We're already just taking a note of the lovely kind of global gathering that we've got going on here. We've got contributors as well from Yerevan and from Istanbul and from other parts of Europe and from the USA, West Coast and East Coast. It's interesting that London sits pretty much in the middle of this, so I guess the hegemony of Greenwich Mean Time seems assured, at least as far as this discussion is concerned. So thanks and kudos for to all of those of you who have either had to get up early in the morning, or to those of you who are staying up late at night. It's just lovely to see so many people. One of the things that both Susan and I noticed when we were inviting people to participate was people rather quickly saying, look, I know about this or that or the other, but I'm hardly an expert in this entire field, or I feel something of an outsider here, or, I see myself really as being someone, who's here, who would be participating in order to learn, really, rather than to necessarily to say everything. And it's interesting to reflect on that for half a moment. It does seem to me that almost all of us have reason to feel that we're outsiders to this field of conversation in some shape or form. We might consider ourselves to be outsiders to Armenian culture, or perhaps outsiders to the Armenian language, or perhaps outsiders to musicology or ethnomusicology or music studies. So it did strike me as being important to say this is a kind of common condition. This is something that we all actually kind of share here. And I think that this is going to make the conversations and discussions that we have, there is the desire for that conversation, there is the desire for that participation, there is a desire to find ways of talking across this space. And I think that that's going to propel us forward in interesting ways over the course of this evening and tomorrow. And I'm really looking forward to this, actually. From I suppose I represent, to the extent that I represent anything, I represent music studies here, or ethnomusicology, or something like that. And from that perspective, from the musicological perspective, I would say our topic is self-evidently hugely important. And at the same time, it also strikes me that Armenian music culture, from a musicological perspective, kind of hides in plain sight. And I think that this is something that we might think about, or that we might consider as the discussion goes on. Armenian names are there at the very birth of comparative musicology. Armenian names are there amongst the entrepreneurs in the story of early sound recording. Armenian names are there amongst the composers at the very heart of 20th century modernism, etc., etc., etc. So this sort of property of kind of ubiquity and hiding in plain sight, but sort of never kind of quite being a kind of focused and comprehensive topic of conversation, strikes me as being interesting. Why, we might ask, is Armenian music so elusive, at least from the perspective of musicology? I suppose it needs to be said at the very outset that studying anything in musicology that is non-Western is hard anyway. I suppose it's also worth saying that Armenian musical rules don't fit neatly into the kind of categories musicologists and ethnomusicologists have worked with in the 20th century: art music, popular music, folk music, and things that tend to be very sort of country defined. We've also got the whole question of the kind of Cold War deep freeze that the whole question of Armenian culture was placed in the early part of my life and my scholarly career. All sorts of things, as we know, have been changing over the last 20 years, and there's been a readiness, I think, for a meeting like this for a long time, and a real desire to extend and deepen this whole conversation. Now, again, from a musical perspective, we've got to avoid romanticization, but music, I think, does make certain things possible. And I think from the outset in my conversations with Susan, this was something that we realized and both felt quite committed to. Music does make certain things possible, sometimes when everything else, pretty much everything else, seems impossible. Sharing and neighborliness, the concept of sharing and the concept of neighborliness is fundamental, I think, to the music cultures of Western and Central Asia. So too is the idea that music troubles, that it sort of turns things upside down. If words settle, music and poetry occupying that intermediate space unsettle. It's where in moments of difficulty we learn to look for commonality. It's where we learn to look for something at our core as human beings. This has, of course, intensified 20th century efforts to claim music for this or that, usually national project. But the history of these efforts has by and large been an unsuccessful one. We can come to how and why as we go on, I guess. But this is why we shouldn't romanticize, of course. That said, music scholars, collectors, archivists, instrument makers, performing musicians have a habit of finding common ground, something to do, I think, with the fact that we all are, or all eventually become, hybrid beings, quite far from the world of pure academic ideas. The institutional space that we occupy, and many of us participating in this conference occupy, is quite a fluid one. And that, I think, can often be our lack of intellectual purity, if you will, I think can be a good thing. This leaves us with the question of what then is Armenian music. Susan and I decided early on to avoid this expression as much as possible, which I think shifts the focus to questions about the processes and histories of making music Armenian, and to the struggles and contests that this inevitably generates. The question is necessarily an open one, and that openness, again, we wanted to signal with our title about borders and neighborliness. And it's a question that we wanted quite simply to leave our distinguished guests and interlocutors to deliberate in their own way. At the very beginning of our discussion about invitees, two names came to the surface instantly, and that was our two guests in this session, Melissa Bilal and Harout Arakelian. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to them. They're going to make a presentation of about 20 minutes each. I'll say a few words at the end of it, and then we can have a little bit of discussion. So maybe we could start with Melissa's paper. You'll be able to find her bio online, so I won't say very much here, but she's Associate Director of the Armenian Music Program and a lecturer in the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA. And previously, she was Assistant Professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the American University of Armenia. She's a graduate of Boğaziçi's famous sociology program in Istanbul, and also of the music department at the University of Chicago, where she wrote her PhD on Armenian lullabies. She's written, as almost everybody here will know, extensively on Armenian cultural history and on women in Armenian cultural history, including important work that she's published with Lena Ekmekcioglu. And her editing and annotation of the Berlin Phonogram Archives recordings of Armenian prisoners of war in Germany came out not that long ago, is a beautiful and immensely important piece of work. So Melissa, lovely to have you with us. Good morning, and I hope that a sunny day faces you in Los Angeles, like the one that we've had here, but no doubt a little bit warmer. Lovely to see you. And over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, it's sunny, as always, in California. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you very much for organizing this conference, dear Martin and dear Susan, my lifelong friends and mentors. Susan as the mentor anthropologist, Armenian anthropologist, and Martin obviously was my dissertation advisor. So this is such an emotional and historic moment for me. So let me a moment to set up my screen. And yes, as Martin said, my talk today is on Koharik Gazarossian, tracing Koharik Gazarossian's life story and music, reflecting on borders. Let me time myself. Okay, here we go. Pianist, composer, and pedagogue Koharik Gazarossian was born in Constantinople, Istanbul, on December 21st, 1907, and died in Paris on October 29th, 1967. She used different Latinized versions of her name. The one you see on the very top got standardized after a point in most of the English and French language publications. Her first name was Alice, and Gazarossian family were given the last name Haser with the Turkish surname law in 1934. So her full legal name as a citizen of Turkey was Alice Koharik Gazarossian Haser. Koharik's mother, Eugenie Nazaryan Gazarossian, was from Eyüp, Istanbul, and father, Krikor Gazarossian, was from Garin, Erzurum. Her elementary education coincided with the World War I. It was the most difficult times for Armenians. The community she grew up in witnessed the arrest and murder of its intellectuals and leaders. It received the news of mass deportations and killings of Armenians all over the empire. During these troubling times, the Gazarossian family stayed in mainland Istanbul and one of its islands, as many other Armenians in Istanbul did. The city of Koharik's early youth looked like a refugee station for Armenian genocide survivors from the provinces. Most of them would soon leave the country, along with the remaining intellectuals, when the victorious Turkish army entered the city soon after Koharik's graduation from Esayan Armenian Community School. And you see a group photo of the graduating class here. Koharik's performing career began at a very early age. She took music lessons from prominent local Armenian and European composers and pianists in Istanbul. Koharik left for Paris in the summer of 1926 and soon began attending French National Conservatory of Music, where she studied piano, harmony, and composition. In 1934, she gave her debut recital as a concert pianist in Paris, where she performed a repertoire including one of her own original compositions. It is around this time that she also worked with Paris Armenian community's Stipan Gomidas choir as a pianist and accompanied the choir singing her choral songs. She gave concerts at several venues, continued composing and teaching piano. Her name regularly appeared in French music journals, and you see one on the slide. In the second half of the 1930s, she also visited Istanbul. This clipping from Arevelk in Istanbul reports that she's coming for 2 months and is expected to have a concert during her stay in Istanbul. In 1939, she moved back to Istanbul due to her mother's health. Throughout the 40s, she had concerts in then famous Istanbul stages, as well as in her own studio. Between 1947 and 1949, for about a year and a half, Gazarossian toured the US and performed in major concert venues, including the Carnegie Hall. Her recital at Brooklyn Museum was aired on the radio. While in New York City, she also worked with famous pianist Edward Weiss. Her recitals were reported in the New York Times, New York Herald Tribune, and other major US newspapers, and by way of these reports, also in Cumhuriyet Daily in Istanbul. Inspired by Johann Sebastian Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier, she studied the individual characteristics of the major and minor tones and the way composers from the 18th to 20th centuries interpreted them. She put together 24 different concert programs, each dedicated to works composed in a key, to show the variety of tonalities each tone contained in it, and how composers experimented with the possibilities this variety opened. The first of these recitals, obviously, was the C major concert, and it was presented in Calvary Baptist Church in 1949 during her US tour. Gazarossian was praised by music critics for this innovative concert idea, and her masterful interpretations of the piano works her technique, dynamism, and maturity as a concert pianist. Upon her return from the US, she began touring several European capitals, Lebanon, Cairo, and Istanbul with the same program, performing on stages such as Salle Gaveau of Paris, Wigmore Hall of London, and appearing on radio and TV across Europe, playing with major orchestras under the batons of many renowned conductors. During this time, Margarit Babayan, then Paris-based famed mezzo-soprano, teacher, and writer, music writer, also known as Gomidas Vartabet's companion and confidant, regularly attended Gazarossian's recitals in Paris and wrote to Istanbul's Kulis Performing Art Journal about them. She repeatedly noted the importance of informing Armenians about the achievements of this internationally acclaimed member of their own community. I don't have all of her concert programs, but in what I have, I don't see any women composers in her music history in one-tone concert programs. I wonder if she ever performed any woman composer other than herself, or any composer other than Gomidas Vartabet who has not been canonized in Western classical music repertoire. An entry about her in the 1958 edition of Musique Larousse was perhaps the first solid step towards writing Koharik Gazarossian into the canon. The fact that she was included in this international encyclopedia made it to the news in Istanbul Armenian press as well. In the 1950s, Koharik performed in Istanbul's Küçük Sahne, Galatasaray High School Conference Hall, Armenian school alumni clubs, as well as her own studio. She spent most of the 1960s in Istanbul. She worked as the chair of the Esayan Alumni Club's music committee, invited many Armenian musicians from different parts of the world, organized concerts for and with them, and regularly wrote about them in Kulis. And on this slide, you see her with various local Armenian musicians in Istanbul, as well as opera singers, Armengirak Sakızlyan visiting from Argentina, and Kohar Kasparyan from Armenia, and violinist Girard Kantarjian visiting from Beirut. Koharik was the liaison between her native community in Istanbul and the Armenians dispersed around the world. She had the dream of forming an organization of Armenian musicians in the diaspora. I'll give you a minute to look at the photographs. When in 1965, Azeri composer and conductor Niyazi Tagizadeh Hacıbeyov was invited to conduct the Istanbul Opera Orchestra, Gazarossian hosted him and a circle of musicians, artists, writers, and journalists in her apartment. She penned a piece for Kulis on Tagizadeh, who was well-versed in the repertoire created by Armenian composers because Tagizadeh conducted many of their works in the Soviet Union, also because he studied composition with the same mentor as Armenian composer Aram Khachadurian. Another musician Koharik wrote about was, of course, Gomidas Vartabet. Her visit to Gomidas's birthplace in Kütahya was one of the most impactful experiences of her life. There she saw his birth home, visited his relatives who told her that during the genocide, they had to burn everything they owned related to Gomidas, except for one issue of one journal that had his photo in it. The piece Gazarossian wrote for Istanbul's Jamanak Daily that you see on the slide on this pilgrimage to Kütahya was reprinted and circulated widely in the diaspora. In 1943, researcher and writer Toros Azadyan, who had some of Gomidas's belongings from his time in Istanbul, trusted Koharik Gazarossian Gomidas's handwritten notebooks. These were Gomidas's transcriptions of 70 songs collected in 1913 from villages in then Yerevan province of Russian Empire, which includes what is today Iğdır in Turkey. Between 1942 and 1947, Gazarossian studied these manuscripts, and her arrangements on 20 of them for voice and piano got published in Lebanon in 1950. When I worked on the Gomidas documents under Toros Azadyan archive in Yerevan, I was able to match the songs in Gazarossian's publication that you see on the screen with those songs in Gomidas's handwritten song collection notebooks from the summer of 1913. So these are the arrangements that she wrote on them. The 1950 publication of Gazarossian's works was not the first. In 1940, a collection of her compositions had been printed in Paris. In 1967, her 24 etudes with Armenian themes came out. Her other published works appeared in Lebanon in 1948 and 1957 in the Husk Yearbook of Armenian Studies. They were polyphonic arranged settings of church melodies. Gazarossian wanted to visit Armenia, but she waited until she could go there full-handed, meaning with more compositions. Her dream never came true, but her work was printed in a famous anthology in Armenia during her lifetime. On the other hand, most of her works remained unpublished until historian and music scholar Harout Arakelian visited Gazarossian's niece, Sona Bedrosian, in Paris in 2001 and got copies of the composer's manuscripts. Arakelian edited, annotated, and published them in separate volumes with introductions enriched with information and analysis of Gazarossian's works presented. Most of Gazarossian's works are for piano, but many others are for different combinations of instruments, such as violin, viola, cello, flute, oboe, and the organ. She has numerous solo and choral works and a ballet suite. I won't talk about her musical language, but I want to note that critics compared her melodies to those of Gabrielle Fauré and her repertoire to that of Bela Bartok, which makes sense. She herself wrote about her stylistic choices. In a letter to her student, Ardashes Shilumyan, she noted that although the 12-tone technique was in fashion then, she still preferred to compose tonal music. In this letter that you see on the screen, she notes that she finished composing her 24 etudes and performed them in Paris. Positive reviews led to an invitation of publishing, and she sent them to the press. She also adds that she completed 7 of her 24 preludes and that she is invited to perform her concerto number 1 with an orchestra in Egypt. In May 1967, Gazarossian was in Egypt. Her appearance on Cairo and Alexandria stages were covered in local Armenian and French newspapers with great admiration. The same year, she played her 24 etude to renowned composer Aram Khachadurian. Koharik Gazarossian passed away in Paris, where she had gone for treatment a few months after her last tour in Egypt. Many friends wrote eulogies for this woman who challenged artificial divides and boundaries with her intellect, wisdom, talent, vision, love, and patience. And they repeated penning their memoirs and holding memorials for her in the following years. One of them was her close friend, writer Adrine Dadrian, with whom she started her artistic career. And Koharik wanted to write an opera on one of Adrine's works. In this photo on the right, you see Koharik Gazarossian, Adrine Dadrian, and the prominent feminist writer Hayganush Mark. When my colleague Lerna Ekmekçioğlu and I were working in Hayganush Mark's archive in Yerevan, we came across letters by Koharik. On this slide, you see one of them written in 1956 on the back of a photograph of her by the piano. Koharik tells Hayganush that she will soon inform her about an event organized to honor her. We know that this event was the 50th year jubilee of Hayganush Mark, and Koharik Gazarossian was in the organization committee. Mark and Gazarossian posed to the camera on July 6, 1957, after a concert by Gazarossian in her apartment in Shishli, Istanbul. The repertoire presented on that day included songs Gazarossian wrote on Mark's poems. As a part of our ongoing book and digital humanities project, Feminism in Armenian, A History in Documents, Lerna Ekmekciol and I, in collaboration with the UCLA Armenian Music Program, revived 4 songs that testify to Koharik's and Hayganush's friendship and collaboration, and I would like to play one of them. And this is the composition, this is the scores. The sheet music comes from Koharik Gazarossian archive in Yerevan, Madenataran, and you see that it's the poem, it's the song setting of a poem by Hayganush Mark. So mezzo-soprano Daniel Sagan and pianist Stephen Van Howard revived it for us. And we are thankful, and this is the document that we kind of revived from the archive. So my last slide here is, you see a few records from my collection that feature Gazarossian's original compositions. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about each of them, but I want to note that pianist Shahan Arzruni has been doing unmatchable work in immortalizing Koharik Gazarossian's work. To conclude, read in context, Koharik Gazarossian's life tells us the history of continuities and ruptures in Armenian life in Turkey. As the examples I presented today demonstrate, she had personal and artistic ties with a circle of Armenian intellectual women and men in Istanbul, and aesthetic ties as a composer and pianist with other Armenian and non-Armenian musicians of her time. She performed in Europe, the US, the Middle East, and North Africa. She made efforts to connect her native community in Istanbul with Armenians around the world and dreamt of starting an organization for musicians in the diaspora. But unfortunately, Turkey's cultural and memory politics resulted in removing her from the country's music history, despite the fact that, as a renowned Turkish music scholar and critic Faruk Yener states, Koharik Gazarossian was one of the leading figures in Istanbul's Western classical music scene. But although she was a passionate supporter of then budding Turkish woman pianist İdil Biret, although she visited Biret at her home in Paris, she played piano with her, dedicated a composition to Biret, and wrote 2 articles about her to Kulis. On one of Biret's visit to Yerevan, Gazarossian herself was erased from Turkey's music history when Biret became the celebrity. The list of first women composers and pianists in Turkey do not include Koharik Gazarossian. It is encouraging to see that her name was brought into the public attention in Turkey very recently. But to shake this systemic silence and absence from the ground, there is only one way. To write her and other Armenian musicians back to the history of Turkey, as we are trying to do today, by paying special attention to their life experiences and conditions of being an Armenian and an Armenian musician in Turkey. Life experiences that do not fit into the grand narratives of Turkish nationalism in its conservative or liberal versions. And I think doing so would be a powerful step towards breaking the borders with and before music. Thank you. 21 minutes. I think my timing was good too, right?
Absolutely impeccable. Thank you.
Okay, I'm muting myself now.
Thanks so much. Let's move straight on to our next speaker in this session, who is Harout Arakelian. Harout is an independent scholar. He's a noted collector of Armenian music and restorer of early sound recordings. His expertise is much in demand. He's been a guest lecturer at UCLA. He's worked with musicians such as Richard Hagopian. He's worked with the Armenian Museum of America's Sound Archive. For those of you who don't know, there's a wonderful webinar that he did last year, I think it was, Harout, on the Tastian brothers and the birth of Armenian recordings, which I recommend extremely warmly. Harout, thanks very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. I'd like to start by thanking Susan, Pattie, and Martin Stokes for this opportunity, and to all of you for logging on. My name is Harout Arakelian, and I'm a collector. My collecting efforts revolve around the Armenian contribution to the landscape of American music, arts, and culture in the first half of the 20th century. I'm not sure if you can still see me, but it's these dusty, fragile discs that we call 78s. In other words, I collect music and records which were recorded and produced in the United States between the early 1900s through the mid to late 1950s. During this era, Armenian Americans throughout the country contributed and left behind these beautiful musical sources of information, and these musicians and these records played a vital role in preserving culture, connecting a dispersed community while maintaining a continuation of Armenian culture, while also contributing to the fabric of America. The Armenian involvement starts very early. As Armenian theater groups were forming and performing stage productions, Armenian-owned music stores and Armenian record dealers began popping up in New York City, West Hoboken, Boston, and Fresno. It's currently believed the first Armenian language musical recordings were produced in 1909 when 29-year-old electro-typer Martiros Tersarkis Toshjan, a non-professional vocalist, entered the recording studios of the Columbia Phonograph Company and documented the Armenian language for the first time in the United States by recording 6 songs. Martiros was born in Harput in 1880, and he migrated to the United States in 1892. And that was the same year Ellis Island opened its immigration station, and it was an era when America had relaxed her immigration laws. So I'd like to start by playing a very short excerpt from his 1909 recording session. This tune again represents the earliest Armenian contribution to American recorded music, and I believe it carries a profound message. The name of the song is Hayrenikut Mortsid, or Forget Your Fatherland. And I'm only going to play a little portion of this. The audio file is courtesy of the Armenian Museum of America's Sound Archive, and a full song is available on their website. So here is Martiros Tersarkis Toshjan with Hayrenikut Mortsid. The following year, Martiros's two younger brothers, Nishan and Levon Dersarkis Tashan, would join him to record an additional 28 songs. After the Tashans, a good number of Armenians recorded for Columbia and Victor labels throughout the 1910s. M.J. Parserian, Karakin Prudyan and Company would record in 1912, followed by Kemani Minas, and later in a decade, Zabel Panosyan, Torkum Bezezian, and Armenak Shamuradian began recording in late 1915 for relief efforts due to the genocide. And in 1923 and 1924, we would see a dynamic activity in the production of Armenian culture. The musical and theatrical communities would firmly plant their roots. Over the course of the decade, nearly a dozen privately owned Armenian-owned music recording labels would come and go. Credit should really be given to three labels for launching this wave of culture: Margosian, Sohag, and M.G. Parserian. M.G. Parserian, or Mugerdich Garabe Parserian, was mentioned earlier, first as a record dealer as early as 1907, then being recorded with his assembled orchestra in 1912 by Columbia Records, and he continues as a record dealer throughout the years, and the first opportunity he has, he purchases a recording device. The first record released on the Parserian label was a tune written by Hovsep Shamilyan and sung by Karakin Prudyan. All of the individuals involved were residents of West Hoboken, New Jersey, and born in Dikranaget. The label would produce dozens of records throughout the decade until finally selling their catalog to the Pharos label. Vota Margosian's self-titled Margosian Records could be considered the first Armenian independent record label, as he began production in mid-1923. And over the course of a mere 2.5 years, from 23 to 25, Vota Margosian's label would produce over 60 records, which means over 120 songs. Margosian seems to have been an amateur musician, not in skill but in trade, as he was a successful photo engraver in the Manhattan, New York area. Margosian was a violinist and a vocalist, and his records were a concerted effort to reproduce the folk musical traditions of Harput, as Margosian himself was from the Sheikh Haji village just outside of Harput. And he was always accompanied by a range of accomplished musicians such as Donabed Perperian, Udis John Berberian, clarinetist Mesrop Takakjian, and they were occasionally heard on the radio in the New York area. The third label is Sarkis Sarafyan's Sohag Records. It was established and began distributing records in early January 1924, and initially the label was called Sohag, which means songbird, but Sarafyan would drop the K, though the word is still pronounced Sohag. He simply transliterated it to Sohag. Sarafyan was an Armenian businessman in New York. He had arrived in 1912 and was a successful import-exporter of goods. While Margosian's label was more of a personal endeavor and he's featured on all of his records, Sohag was initially connected to the new Armenian theater in America, with the arrival of the theater troupe led by Setrag and Masha Surabyan. While it's true the vast majority of Armenians in America were from Western Armenia, we could suggest that the Surabyans represent the art created and shared by Eastern Armenians. Masha Surabyan, also known as Marie, was born in Ekaterinodar, modern-day Krasnodar, Russia, on February 16, 1896. Her musical training began at a young age when she attended the Moscow Conservatory of Music. And while touring with a theater company sometime in the late 1910s, Masha met Armenian actor Setrak Surabyan, presumably in Tiflis. After a brief courtship, they returned to Masha's hometown and were married in 1919. Setrak Surabyan was born in Tiflis, March 6, 1894, and from a young age, he began a deep involvement with the Armenian theater. He's first seen in 1915 performing in Tiflis as part of the Hayots Dramatic Company and High Actors Association. It seems he moved through various acting companies until meeting Masha and finally establishing their own company, the High Dramatic Operetta Troupe, or Armenian Dramatic Operetta Troupe. From 1919 to 1921, they toured various Armenian communities with performances in Tiflis, Yerevan, Baku, and Smyrna, and Constantinople. Setrak and Masha Surabyan would arrive to the United States in January of 1923 and immediately began to contribute to a fledgling Armenian-American acting and musical community. Masha's first performance was February 12, 1923 at the Hotel Commodore, which was weeks after they had arrived. During the first half of that year, Setrak was busy reorganizing their Armenian dramatic operetta troupe. Joining the troupe would be pianist Professor Koshnarian and a young actor from Dikranaget, Setrak Vartyan, and his wife Ankin. When a troupe was finally ready, it seems like they never stopped. The Surabyans would premiere their adaptation of Haji Beyov's Ashim Alalan on March 25th, 1923, about 6 weeks after their arrival, and begin touring the eastern United States by staging a variety of operettas such as Abush and Ashur Gharib. By the end of the year, Masha's popularity would only be rivaled by Zabel Panosyan. Beginning in 1924, the Surabyans would accomplish something that none of their contemporaries would do except for Edward Bogosian, and that would be to press records. The Sohag record label published a set of 10 records featuring Setrak and Masha Surabyan, and these discs coincided with their stage shows. The 10 discs, which represent 20 songs, consisted of the entire operetta of Ashim Alalan. It would be transcribed to disc, as well as additional songs such as Yerevan Baghemarel, Oror, Vart, and an original composition we believe Setrak composed himself, Yarunei Chinar Boyov. Though these discs are the completion of Masha Surabyan's recording career, she continued to thrive on a stage. And the Sohag label continued to flourish. Sohag's catalog is an example of the wide spectrum of Armenian music, and the label would go on to record opera and vaudeville star Torkum Bezezyan. It would also record the previously mentioned folklorist of Harput, Vartan Margosyan, Armenian-American singer and songwriter Dikranaget-born Hovsep Shamilyan, as well as the last records of the influential vocalist Karik Imprudyan of Dikranaget. By the end of the decade, Sohag would have produced and commercially released over 40 discs. The last handful of discs featuring Setrak Surabyan again, but this time accompanied by Tabriz-born tautist George Shabaronyan. I sort of wanted to highlight the various places and musicians on the Sohag label came from, as it seems no matter where they came from, these creators of culture were dedicated to entertaining Armenian audiences. Setrak Surabyan's professional collaborations with Shabaronyan would sustain them for decades to come. George Shabaronyan was born in Tabriz, Iran in 1897 and raised in Tiflis, an excellent tar player who was frequently heard on the radio in New York City. But Shabaronyan's stay in America would initially be short-lived, as he and Setrak Surabyan would leave to tour Paris and perform Ashur Gharib, among other productions. And it seems Masha remained and pursued a career on the American stage and achieved some success. And a member of the troupe, Setrak Vartyan, continued to perform at Armenian events while also being signed to an acting contract with the Fox Movie Company. When Surabyan and Shabaronyan would return to the United States in 1929, the acting troupe's popularity continued to grow. While continuing their work on the Armenian stage, it seems like Vartyan, Surabyan, and Shabaronyan inched toward the movie business. And we get to 1937, when Setrak Vartyan would produce, direct, and act in the first Armenian language film produced in America, Ashim Alalan. The small cast would feature Setrak and Masha Surabyan, and I'd like to play a very short scene from the film. and it actually features all the principal characters that I've been discussing. So here's a short scene from 1937 Arshim Malala. Nearly every member of Surabyan's acting troupe would move to California and find themselves in bit roles in Hollywood. Setok Surabyan started his own production company and has a brief cameo in a film called The Spectre of the Rose. George Shabaronyan's music was featured in a movie starring Humphrey Bogart and Zero Mostel titled Sirocco and an early Lucille Ball film. He would later release a box of records in the early 1950s. Setok Vartyan, while working in Hollywood as an editor and director, would also produce an additional 3 Armenian language films. He would separate from his then wife, Angin Vartyan, and remarry Zaru Elmasyan in Los Angeles, and together they would be instrumental in establishing the nonprofit, the Armenian Allied Arts. Like Shabaronyan, the couple Zaru Elmasyan and Setok Vartyan would release their own set of records. By the 1950s, nearly every Armenian community in America was visited by the Surabyan acting group. And because this troupe was small in number, they often relied on local Armenian talent, teaching a new generation the plays they brought with them in the 1920s and the plays they created during the decades in between, thus enabling the communities to continue putting on the productions after the Surabyans left town. The Surabyans dedicated their artistic careers to the Armenian community. On the occasion of Setok's 40th Jubilee celebration, which was held in Los Angeles at the Wilshire Ebell Theater on March 7, 1954, Masha Surabyan addressed the capacity audience and said of her and her husband's inspiring careers, and I quote, "He has made these sacrifices gladly and has worked willingly, and the Armenian theater has been a spiritually satisfying experience. Speaking for myself, if I were to live over and were asked what I wanted to be, I would say, without hesitation, an Armenian actress." At the same event, Setok Surabyan said the following: "It has been my great desire to keep the Armenian language a living language and to introduce our culture to other cultures. The theater has been my medium. Whatever success I have had in accomplishing my aim, I owe to the Armenian audience." The traditions established from earlier in the century influenced the American-born generation of Armenian Americans. The humor and the wit of entertainers like Setok Surabyan and Edward Bogosian carried over into the musical and local theaters. It's no coincidence that the boys from the Vospikyan band would record songs from operettas the Surabyans performed, as we've seen them in events performing together, or at least on the same bill. The Surabyans indirectly or even directly were influential on the new wave of Armenian American music and theater. And it was a new era, and original plays were being written by young Armenian Americans. Of note, a comedy written in Philadelphia titled Darots Chemuzed, I Don't Want a Wedding, by Avedis Kevorkian, who was the son of the editor of the Gurung newspaper. This play found great popularity among the youth throughout Armenian American communities, and it went on for a number of decades. Another production was seen in Fresno and Los Angeles was written by Gaitzak Gai Chukurian and Leo Donelian, titled Gesuras, My Mother-in-Law. While Guy Chukurian is probably best known for his song Turapat Stikran and his ability to take popular American songs and translate them and adapt them to Armenian songs, he, along with his sister Sue, were very active in the Armenian theater scene. They started their own theater company called the Armenian Theater Group in Fresno in the mid-1940s. Both of the plays, Darots Tremuzet and Gesuras, mixed both Armenian and English in the dialogue. And it seems Guy Chukurian and his generation of musicians, the Vospikians and a number of others, felt the same way as Setok Surabyan in having this desire to keep the Armenian language a living language. So much so that Guy Chukurian wrote a tune called Nor Seruntin Yerka. And I'd like to close the talk by playing the song. As the title says, it's a song for the new generation. And his opening monologue might be funny, but it should also be paid attention to. Thank you for your time, and let us listen to Nor Seruntin Yerka by Guy Chukurian.
Սիրելի հայրենագիտներ, այսօր թշպախտաբար մեր նոր սերունդին մեծամասնությունը հայերեն չի գնար խոսել։ Ու մաս մգա, որ դժվարությամբ կհասկնա հայերենը։ Երբ օդարմը իրենց հարցնե, թե դուք ինչ ասկեք, իհարկե պիտի պատասխանեն մենք հայ ենք։ Ու երբ մեկը իրենց հարցնե, թե ուտելիքը ինչ տեսակ բան է, կսեն շիշ քեբաբ, փիլավ եւ այլն։ Շիշ քեբաբը գիտենք ինչ է, փիլավն ալ գիտենք ինչ է, բայց այս եւ այլն ասված բանը ինչ է, ինչ որ է։ Երբ ուրիշ մա հարցնե իրենց, «Ձեր նվակը ինչ տեսակ նվակ է», կարելի է 1-2 եղանակ գտնան, բայց բառերը չեն գիտեր։ Եվ այս հեղինակությունը պատրաստած եմ նոր սերունդին համար։ Երբ այս երկը սորվին ու երկեն, իրենց ծնողները ուրախ պիտի զգան, թե իրենց զավակները հայերեն կրնան երկել։ Ու օդարներուն վրա մեծ դպավորություն պիտի թողու, որովհետև իրենք արդեն բառերը չեն հասկնալ։ Հիմա պիտի երկեմ այս երկը ցեզի համար, ուշադրությամբ մտի գրեք, որովհետև միայն մեկ անգամ պիտի երկեմ։ Լավ մտի գրեք, որ սորվի։ Մեկ, երկու, երեք, չորս, հինգ, վեց, յոթ, ութ, հինգ, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 Vatsuna meg, vatsuna yerguk, vatsuna yerek, vatsuna chos, vatsuna hing, vatsuna yerek, vatsuna chos, vatsuna hing, vatsuna vets, vatsuna yota, vatsuna uta, vatsuna ina, yotana sun, vatsuna uta, vatsuna ina, yotana sun.
That was Guy Chukurian and his Harputep Cats with Nor Seruntin Yerka. The opening monologue, he talks about language, and in it, he says he's composed a song for the new generation of Armenians. And there's a subtle line in there that he says, when Armenians learn this song, it'll be very impressive to their non-Armenian friends because they won't understand what's being sung. So I would translate that part, but I think I'll just leave that as Guy's joke. I'd like to thank you all for your time and patience, and I hope the artists I highlighted display a dynamic musical culture, and it's exciting to research these characters and celebrate their contributions to sustaining culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa and Harout. They're just amazing
You
talks,
might want to start again.
just so interesting. It's okay. I think I'm audible. Yeah, thank you both for such amazing presentations about such extraordinary individuals. Thanks too for illustrating them so richly with sounds and images which have their own story to tell, of course, and just so important to hear these people as well. Both talks, it seemed to me, pointed to fascinating cultural, musical and media networks and the important ways in which these took shape across these huge spaces in and through music. I thought that was truly fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, and both talks, I think, are adequate testimonies to the amazing work that you both do, and the kind of conversation that I know goes on between you. These two papers, although they speak to one or another side of something that we would approach as a sort of high and low culture divide, actually point to the entanglement of those, I think, in very interesting ways. So thank you very much for sharing this with us, and allow me to say just how much I admire and enjoy and learn from your work. I've been given the job of discussant, but actually there's really not much time to discuss, so I'll just make a few observations and invite both of you to respond to them, and then we can move on quickly to questions and comments as well. And if we have to cut things off a little bit early this evening, there'll be tons of time tomorrow. So if you don't manage to get a word in this evening, just save your thoughts for tomorrow and we'll make sure they get heard then. So just working backwards and starting with Harout's paper, and it's very interesting knowing a little about your previous work, Harout, to see you moving into the world of theatre and film, and this just seems to me to be hugely interesting. The first Armenian language movie, Arshin Mal Alan, in 1937. Wow, I just found that completely fascinating and wanted to know much more about it. But the thought that sprang to mind watching the scene of festivity and dancing was the immediate kinship that I sensed between that and Egyptian cinema, and it kind of strikes me as worth mentioning, because until sort of sometime into the sound movie era, cinema history was quite a global proposition, wasn't it? I mean, we tend to see everything as being Hollywood led these days, but if you look back to the 1910s and the 1920s and the early 1930s, actually the Egyptian cinema industry was the site of an enormous amount of innovation and all sorts of interesting things going on there. And so I was curious to know more about the song and dance scenes, the connections that immediately sparked in my mind with early Egyptian film at this particular moment, and whether the networks of Armenian sort of cultural entrepreneurs that we're talking about had connections there as well. One of the things that struck me about your paper was the way in which things sort of seem to fall. A rift seems to emerge between the Mardaros Tashjian kind of project here, which was a sort of, how can I put it, a project of kind of national seriousness, a kind of political project. I suppose in today's language we would describe it as a kind of activism, I suppose you could say. So you have that on the one hand, and then the other major subject of your talk here today, the Sorabian troupe, with their orientation towards entertainment. So I wanted to know a little bit more about how you saw the distinction between the national project, the political project, if you will, and the entertainment project. How one understands the difference and the distinction between those two things, how that might have looked, I think, in the 1920s and the 1930s, indeed up to the right up into the 1950s. I mean, it strikes me, particularly looking with your later examples, that these, through language, these two things start to kind of become entangled once again. But that was another thought on my mind, was, how one talks about the relationship between quote unquote politics and quote unquote entertainment, looking at this material. Yes, various other questions here. Oh yeah, so I was going to ask a little bit more about the Vartan Margosian project, and it interested me. In your paper, you mentioned, and I'm quoting here, that his concerted effort to reproduce the folk music of Harbert. I was just interested, I'm quite ignorant about this, to know, what was folk and what does reproduction mean in this context, and what was motivating him, do you think? And a final question was where you came to end wonderfully with Guy Chakurian and the Harput Hepkat. I was put in mind of Mohammed Al-Bakr, the Lebanese singer, who was a serious and talented singer of Arab classical music, moved to the States, got in early with the 1950s belly dancing scene, mixed a great deal in the nightclub world with the Greeks, Turks, and Armenians of there. And the story, I don't know whether it's one that's familiar to you or not, but the interesting story is one of a certain kind of descent into a kind of kitsch Orientalism. The 1950s, so how did Armenians of his generation, who were swimming in these kind of mass media waters, how did they negotiate that? How did they, as it were, maintain the seriousness of their project with the kind of the kitsch Orientalism of that period? A few comments about Melissa's paper. Gazarossian, just what an extraordinary individual. It's just, everything that I learn about her is just completely fascinating. A performer, a composer, an arranger, a teacher, a mentor of younger players. Everything about this person seems to be interesting and important and worth knowing about and worth recognizing. I was struck by her own comment after her visit to Kütahya and visiting the home of Gomidas, and having this encounter with his arrangements of the folk music from Urdur, and his arrangements for the piano, and her own experiments in the 1950s. And the statement, I came across this in the written version of your papers, her statement that she is finally speaking Armenian in music. And I wonder, can we unpack this a little bit? What's going on in this sentence here? What was the kind of, where did she feel that she had come from, and where did she think that she was going? And I mean, the question about where she's going is interesting, because she's thought on this sort of vast kind of Bachian kind of, systematic kind of scale. So, was there was this imagined as the first step in a kind of huge sort of synthesizing and systematizing project that maybe got somewhere, but maybe didn't go all the way to the end? I mean, what do we need to know about this interesting statement here, that she's finally speaking Armenian in music? The second thing that struck me about the way in which she moved around the world, yes, I mean, a global figure, a global cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world in certain ways, but a citizen of a very divided world. If you're thinking about the 1960s, and outside of America, she's clearly moving in the non-aligned world, in the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Egypt. She was in Egypt in 1967, an extraordinarily important year to be in Egypt. And I immediately found myself thinking about who she might have bumped into in Egypt, what symphony orchestras were up and running in 1967, able to play music of this complexity, what meetings she might have had with the Armenian composers in Egypt, who were hugely important in the world of movie soundtracks. And Fouad Zaharia is somebody I've been interested in recent years, an Armenian. Seems to me to have been a very kindred spirit. It's just a way of saying that it's also, I mean, her story is also the story about the non-aligned world. It seems to me in the 1960s and the cultural politics of that world. And what you're doing, it seems to me, opens up all sorts of doors here that maybe people certainly in Egypt haven't much thought about pressing on. Third, final comment here, how am I doing? Yeah, is just about recognition and canonicity. I've sensed an ambivalence in your talk about the need for recognition on the one hand, but the problems and perils of canonization on the other. As people who work in the world of music, we know that being canonized is not necessarily a good thing. Canons work in rather conservative ways. They put things in museums, and I don't think that that's a fate that you would want to visit on Gazarossian. So I was curious to know how you sort of thought about the relationship between the kinds of scholarly recognition that you feel are her due, perhaps in Turkey, perhaps elsewhere, and her place in something that we might loosely call the canon. So yeah, those were the thoughts that your wonderful papers just triggered in me. They may or may not spark responses in you, that but that was how I found myself reflecting on them. So I'll hand over to you. I just say, by all means, say anything that you want in response to that, and then we can just see where the conversation takes us, looking in our chat bar as well. Harout, would you like to?
Sure. Well, one thing I want to say, and I guess apologize to a great number of musicians, because I only highlighted a handful of people. And over the course of this era of music, the first half of the 20th century, so many other musicians and artists were around who I just wasn't able to mention during the talk. On stage, we had Edward Bogosian, the Antranik Theater Group. There was just a wide array of different characters. And in this 20 minutes, I had to omit a lot of them. There was a question about Vartan Margosian, and we see from his first 20 records that they're explicitly from a certain place, being Harput. And they're in multiple languages, in Armenian, Turkish. There's one song where he goes through 3 languages, Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish. So that's why I called him the folklorist of Harput, because he was in America, and according to my associate Harry Kazayan's research, it's in 1923 the last orphanage in Harput is closed down, and that's pretty much when Vartan Margosian starts this endeavor of recording music. There was a few notes that I made, but now I'm not keeping track of them. But Ara Dinkjan has his compilation that was just released of Armenians recording it in the 78 RPM era. And I think he might agree that what we've seen is just this vast amount of music. So your question about how Margosian relates, or Toshjan relates to other eras, personally, I see it as one thread of culture being created. So if Toshjan is a little bit more, the music is political oriented, I don't know if it's too detached from others. It's Armenians creating music in America. And it's difficult to put them all in one category, especially when we get to the late 1940s and the early 1950s. Guy Chukurian is his own entity. He was a comedian and a musician and an actor and an entertainer. And at the same time, we had on the East Coast a number of other musicians that were not as comedic. They were really good. They were very serious, but they were also having fun. There's just a wide spectrum of music that's in this collection that can be appreciated by anybody, because there's so many different genres. Regarding the film, the 1937 film, it was an independent production. These guys financed it themselves. And in the history, you know, in America itself, there weren't too many independent productions from 1937. So the camera work isn't great. The screen direction isn't great. But there's something really charming about it. And going over the movie the past couple of days, I found it really funny, and I really appreciated Masha Surabyan's acting ability. It was really based on a success that they had with their stage production of the operetta. And the Surabyans include with Setog Balkan have they put it on for continuously from the 20s until the 50s and on actually. I know there was a few other questions, but
Oh, that's wonderful. No, that's very interesting. I mean, just the more I think about film, this kind of coming together of theatre and operetta and sort of gadget experimentalism, I suppose you could say, is it just rings so many bells with the early Egyptian cinema that I've been interested in recent years as well. So yeah, that was what triggered that question. Yeah, thanks. Melissa, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I really liked your comment. I mean, because of time constraints, I think I was only able to share the details, the exciting details of her life story, but there's a lot of kind of socio-political, like economic, historical, like background I can talk about, and I really liked that you brought this the specific time period, the interwar, that she was moving around the world in the interwar and Cold War years in a divided world. And as you said, she was in, I didn't bring it up in my presentation, but it was in the written version. She was in Poland for a composition contest. And then she, for her, she had ties with both, as you said, the US. She was very well known in the US, and not only the Armenian community in the US, but basically the New York Times and Carnegie Hall and all these American, prominent American publications, radio and television. But at the same time, she had strong ties with the Soviet Union. And it is so remarkable that when Tagizadeh, as a Soviet composer, as an Azeri composer, comes to Istanbul, she is the #1 person, probably. We don't know the backstory, but it was so obvious, so natural that she was invited to meet him and to communicate with him, and then to talk maybe about Aram Khachadurian with him. And you saw the photograph that they had this party at home in Shishli, and they had a lot to talk about. So she brought musicians from Soviet Armenia as well to Istanbul, and she herself wanted to go to Armenia, and she got one of her compositions published in Armenia, in like, which was technically, we're talking about, you're very right, a time where there's the so-called Iron Curtain, and the relation, like Turkey being a NATO member and Armenia being an Eastern Bloc country. So you're very right. I will think more about it, and I will go to that direction. About Egypt, it's also fascinating. This also tells us a lot about, kind of from a scholarly perspective, that is kind of the, I think, the core of this conference, that and it connects back to your comments about Armenian music as a field of study, has a lot to offer to the field of ethnomusicology, music, the music studies, music and sound studies, because there's an organic way of breaking borders, like it's transnational. So she was able to give, I don't want to say that all of her gigs were to the Armenian community, but this is also the natural kind of structure of being a diasporic nation. So she, as an Armenian musician, she's in Istanbul and she's touring around the world, and through her networks, through the Armenian network, which is an important, and that's also how she is imagining bringing all these Armenian musicians in the diaspora together to create these networks. That's about Egypt. I am looking at my notes. The only person I have French and Armenian language sources, and this is very important. After your comment, I will definitely go and find Egyptian Arab language sources and see who she was in contact with in Egypt. But in the Armenian newspaper, it says that the person who wrote about her in French, in the French newspaper, was Antoine Guénau. I don't know who he was. I Googled him and I kind of have a, he was a music critic. So now you're, as always, giving me research, more research ideas that maybe I can go to each kind of community, each locality she has been to, and dig into some more information and see all these networks and connections that she made, who invited her, with whom she, and what was going on in that particular country at that point. And yeah, maybe think more in terms of local music history. That actually connects, I don't want to take up too much time, but that connects to this question of canonization. Obviously, this is the first, not the first time, but this is also in my dissertation, but going maybe theorizing a little bit about what Western classical music, the role Western classical music plays in Armenian minority experience or minority history in Turkey. And this was Koharik was in my dissertation, and I talk a little bit about piano and piano teachers, early Republican Turkey, and how Armenian musicians were basically the mentors, the teachers, the performers, because they had this, the ones who stayed in Turkey, they basically trained most of the musicians in that we read in the history of Turkey's music scene. So that's an important, there's an important discussion there in terms of canonization. I'm approaching it with all the criticism we have to canonization, silencing and exclusion, and the elite kind of understanding of Western classical music, class, gender. These are all the things that I have in mind. And obviously there's a lot to discuss in terms of class and Western classical music there. So yeah, that's something I have in mind, and I've been thinking about a lot. And this problematic kind of concept of the canon. Here we actually have two questions. One is Turkish nationalism and the exclusion of non-Muslim, non-Turkish speaking musicians from that canon, the history, or let's say in the narrative. And also we have the problem of Western classical music, all the problems of the politics of canonization. In that sense, this is a very intricate and actually very kind of productive discussion, because I'm looking at someone who, as you said, was a believer of tonal music, and her hero was Bach. As I said, there is no, she's close friends with a feminist woman, actually not one, the whole feminist circle in Istanbul were her friends. She was one of them. She was in the organization committee for many events together, but in her repertoire that she performed, she didn't look for a woman composer from the so-called West. So but she inserted herself to that. Like there are a lot of things to discuss there. She's inserting herself, she's seeing herself as part of that canon or tradition, but it's only her. There is no other woman composer in that. So I have to say that, you know, there is this acceptance, like pre-given acceptance of through her basically education or like all the problems that we know in terms of Western classical music history and canon, that she's reproducing them, because in that concert series that she has, music history in one tone, you see only, you know, the usual suspects basically, but she inserts gomidas in them, so she's experimenting a lot. And I mean, I have to write a paper, more like scholarly analytical paper, to get into these discussions. In terms of her finally speaking Armenian, that's, I think, the discussion that we want to raise in this conference, that I think it's because of what you said. All of her education, all of her background was, you know, becoming a concert pianist, being able to play Chopin, Bach, and, you know, all the like early 20th century composers as well. But she, as you said, like she has this kind of urge to learn more about Armenian music. And for that, it's, I think what she means there is the modality. I'm just speculating, because she writes that she actually reflects on that experience. When they hand her the manuscripts, Gomidas' song collection manuscripts, it's something new for her, because she never studied Hampartum, because these manuscripts are, transcriptions are in Hampartum and in Armenian notation. And she dedicates like 6-7 years to self-teach how to read Hampartum and learn the melodies and the modes and everything, and the ornamentation and embellishments. So it's a new kind of musical language for her. She does what Gomidas does, and I think tomorrow we'll discuss more about this, that, you know, what is authentic, what is, you know, all these problems that we are aware of, that what she does is she studies Gomidas' arrangement strategies, and she tries to actually do what Gomidas might have done with these songs. So I know this is, I think this is a long conversation, but I would love to have this conversation in the future. But I think I will cut it here because
and noting response. I've got an echo. No, it's gone now. Yeah, I mean, there's a difference, isn't there? There's not so much that there's a difference. There's a tension, I guess, between setting the record straight, critical recognition or critical engagement, and canonization and memorialization. And it strikes me that your project is, you know, one of the things that is going on here is that you're trying to find a way of handling, I think, all of those tensions. Yes, it's interesting, and in both of your responses and indeed in your papers, I think Neighbours have already begun to, and neighborliness has also begun to make their presence and it felt. We can actually, it seems to me, I've been given the green light to have another 10 minutes of discussion, and we've already got some stuff coming up on the chat. Unfortunately, I didn't bring my glasses, but maybe Susan can actually,
Yeah, I could read them. Or you
can read that. No, that's not working.
Okay,
I'll
read
pass
the
over
questions.
to
We've had a lot of thank yous throughout the chat line while you two were talking. People are really, really pleased, really thrilled. And this two questions from Jacob Oli, who will be speaking tomorrow, everybody. He says, 2 brilliant presentations, many thanks. Questions about chronology. One for Harout. Was that the first Armenian language record in 1909 anywhere or just in America? Why don't you answer first, and then we'll go
okay.
on.
No, the 1909 Taschan recordings were what we believe to be the first recordings in the United States of America. There was a number of other recordings earlier, also in 1909 in Gyumri by Gomidas Vatabed and one of his students. In 1902, there was a number of recordings from Tiflis, and throughout the early 1900s in Tiflis, Sofia, and a few other places, there were other recordings. We even think that there's some as early as 1898, but we haven't found those yet. So the 1909 recordings that I discussed, the Taschan ones, were the first recordings in the United States of America.
Thank you. And Melissa from Jacob Still, another question. You've perhaps read it. I'll just read it for everybody. Gazarossian was mentioned in the Turkish press in the 1940s, and it seemed as if she was visible in Turkey at this time. At what point does she disappear or become less visible in the Turkish language archive? And is that connected with a particular political moment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's something that I have been thinking on and trying to theorize in terms of like memory politics, culture politics, history of culture in Turkey. So this is something that I have in mind, and it really goes back to my dissertation work. This is where it was something that I came across, and then I think Martin's question, I'm still thinking about Martin's questions. So what happens is, as you all know, starting in the mid 19th century, urban elite, bourgeois, upper middle class Armenians, they actually, some of them are the descendants of former amiras, like aristocrats, Ottoman Armenian urban elites. Children, they go to Europe and they receive, some of them obviously receive education and they become lawmakers in the Ottoman Empire, or they become writers and intellectuals. Some of them bring Western classical music, which also doesn't mean that there was no Western classical music in the Ottoman Empire. We all know, I mean, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but we know that Ottoman Western classical music, however you want to define it, like European elite art music, was present in the Ottoman capital and in other cities. So basically what happens is those people, like Chukhajian, who come back and start the Ottoman opera and operetta musical theater, and others like Harout Sinanyan and Papelian. So and the generation who are trained under them, or they were trained by local Levantine European musicians in Istanbul. So there's a vibrant European art music scene in Istanbul in late 19th century, which is again going back to this like canons, borders, divisions, boundaries. I talk about this in my dissertation, but we all like talk about this in different places, as Martin does in his work, that these worlds were not that divided. The borders were artificially put later in the Republican period, because we know from looking at musician biographies is an important thing in ethnomusicology methodology to break these canon and genre boundaries, borders. We know that the same person was active in Ottoman classical music or in, urban popular music, and played the makam, and then also was a church cantor, and also was a classical violinist, let's say. So like these, looking at people's musicians' biographies and their circles make us, give us this tool to go beyond these boundaries, borders that are imposed by modernization projects or westernization or all like, and the Orientalism that is involved in it. So what happens, but towards the early 20th century, this is really what I want to study more and theorize more. So after the genocide, when all these like Western style fanfare orchestras in, Armenian schools in different parts of the Ottoman Empire are dispelled, we don't even know where the instruments went. or piano playing, you know, Armenian women, piano playing was an important thing. If you were an elite upper middle class Armenian woman, you should speak French and play the piano if you want to like have a good marriage. All these things. But in the after the genocide, we see a number of music, because this is a general argument that I'm making in music history. We talk about the genocide, we always talk about the ruptures, obviously, but we are also talking about continuities marked with the ruptures. So the continuity is some people stayed and they're there. They are doing what they were doing before in different conditions, obviously. So it's important to look at how conditions are changing for them. For example, Koharik was born in the Ottoman Empire. And then her, that's why I gave the biography, that like her high school years is during the World War I, and like all of a sudden things are changing for her and for her community. She's staying, she was able to stay until 1926. This is when they said, okay, this is time for a young woman to go Europe, because like we don't know what's, so the early Republican period, maybe up until 1930s, 40s, is in and of itself is a complicated time in terms of minority politics, what is possible, what is impossible. But in 1940s, you know, especially towards the end of 30s and 40s, you know, it's becoming stricter because Turkey is flirting with Nazi Germany, and all these like policies of like citizens speak Turkish. And in that kind of context, my theory is, and this is kind of, again, like going back to Martin's question, what does the Western European classical music like does? Because if you're a Western pianist, you're not singing Armenian, you're more like, this gives you a little bit flexibility and recognition. And that's why I kind of argue that Armenian, especially women pianists in early Republican Turkey are very important research topic. And I really am writing about it, I'm researching about it, because Koharik is not the only person. So they were a liaison between communities. That's a point of contact, because somebody like Faruk Yener, he goes to, he has another teacher, piano teacher in Kadıköy, whose name is Koharik, which is not Koharik Gazarossian, but he talks about how going to this Armenian woman's house in early Republican, like first decades of the Republic, and learning how to play the piano, because these are the master piano teachers in Istanbul, and going into an Armenian household and getting acquainted with Armenians or Greeks or Jews. So this is like non-Muslim women in early Republican period as piano teachers to this like upcoming, in a period where Turkish music policies are towards like Turkification and like silencing everything that is other than that is not Turkish. I kind of want to see some points of resistance that classical music, like European classical repertoire, introduces, maybe in a way that is not possible in like Central Europe. I don't know, maybe in we should look at Jewish case in post World War II. But this is something I have in mind. Also in Egypt, like also the different parts of the Middle East and the Caucasus, I want to understand the possibilities this repertoire created for people to come together and get to know each other. So back to your question, 1940s, yes, her name was in Cumhuriyet, but they didn't mention that she was Armenian. There's no mention that her, she performed in Armenian. They were amazed. I mean, this is classic Turkey, right? Somebody, a Turkish citizen, that they couldn't care less because she's Armenian, goes and like, I don't know, wins the Nobel Prize or does something, like shows up in the New York Times. And Cumhuriyet didn't interview Koharik. Cumhuriyet reported from the New York Times and saying that it's a young woman from Turkey who was recognized and like it was, accomplished pianist. It's not even like of course her name is there, but there's
Melissa.
every effort to basically kind of silence or who she is. And the thing is, I think that's the lost generation. My answer to your question is 1950s onwards, when that generation who were born in the late Ottoman Empire and continued staying in Istanbul, in Turkey, and basically raised a generation of musicians, they slowly kind of like disappeared, because this is also the time economy is being Turkified, culture is being Turkified. So I can't tell you like when exactly, but it makes a lot of sense for me when I think of like history of modern Turkey, that like 50s and 60s are weird times, and 70s are, although there was a rising leftist movement in the 70s, it's when we see less and less non-Muslims in the, sorry, this was like a short history of Turkey.
Thank you very much. That was a very extremely rich answer. Thanks very much. There are a couple of maybe what we'll do, because we do have to be conscious of the different time zones here, is maybe just read out a couple of the interesting comments that have come in.
John, that we should ask.
Yeah, I mean, even if we just read the question and then maybe come back to it tomorrow, maybe
there won't be. I don't think there'll be a time.
Well, anyway, let's I think just read out both.
Okay.
Harry.
We have a long comment from Harry Gazelian, which is to add to what Harout was saying earlier. I'll just read that through, Harry. Thank you very much for that. And then we'll come back to Aradink John's two quick questions. And then I'm afraid we're going to have to stop soon. Harry says, again, thank you both for your excellent presentations. And to help my friend Harout out, thanks for the shout out. My research shows that Vartan Margosian put out his first recordings in September 1923 from a historical standpoint. This is immediately after the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, ending the Armenian question in Turkey. Earlier that year, the last Armenian survivors in the major orphanage in Kharpert were evacuated, in quotes, and sent to Gazir, Lebanon. In late 1923, we see Margosian's records. The following year, another explicitly Harput folk music. The following year, 1924. Another explicitly Harput folk music oriented label, Yeprad Records, appears in Boston, as well as the publication of the short story collage, Kluche, I think, The Village. Oh, Kure, The Village. I can't read either. By the Kharpert-born writer Hamastech, who had migrated to Boston as well. This became an extremely well-known piece of diaspora literature. The implication, to me at least, was an effort to salvage a life that had come to a definite end with the political events of 1923. Thank you, Harry. And Harry's, I'm not going to ask my questions because we're running out of time, but we'll go on. Martin says we'll continue tomorrow, but I know we're going to have a lot more interesting talks and things tomorrow, but we're going to just have Aras. I want to go into this Kharpert, Providence, Boston, Philadelphia hub, and then the California hub at some point. It'd be interesting to talk about that, but not right now. Last question from Aradinkjan, whom we will be hearing from tomorrow night. He says, thank you, Melissa and Harout, for your fantastic, precious research. Two questions. Harout, was that Shah Baronian playing in the film? Melissa, are there recordings of Koharik playing? So, Harout.
The quick answer is yes. And what's really impressive is that when you see the film, you hear it. It was location sound. They were recording the sound there live as it was happening. So we have Shah Baronian on the instruments, Setak Vatkan singing, Setak Surabian at the end. So yes, that is Shah Baronian.
Thank you. And Melissa?
Quick answer is right now, I don't know the answer. I don't have any, but I should mention that this research is very new for me, and I put together information from the family archive and different, published and unpublished archive. But the next step is going into deep into the archive in Yerevan and see what is in there. And I'm sure there should be, because she was on the radio, so I have to go to the radio archives.
Great. Well, I hope that works out. That would be great. That would be next installment. Right. Do you want to say goodbye? I'm gonna close.
I will say goodbye. Harout and Melissa, thank you for your contributions and leading such a wonderful discussion, which has really just set us off absolutely on the right foot. Very much looking forward to tomorrow. I'll hand over to Susan to sign off.
Well, a huge thank you to Martin, Harout, and Melissa. That was a fabulous start to our 24 hours together. We need to have a pajama party next time. But this has been, we knew it was going to be great, and it's been even better than we hoped for. So thank you very much, all three of you. And thank you to everybody who came, for your support, for your questions. I want to say a special thank you before I go on to Melissa, because we had some really interesting and very, very helpful conversations at the beginning of this. As Martin says, not a month ago, but more like maybe 9 months ago or something like that. It's been a while happening, and I really appreciate that. And it's a lot of what we're doing is thanks to Melissa's ideas as well. Tomorrow we start at 1 o'clock. Please come back. Please join us. That's for those of you who will be awake. Those of you who aren't, we will be recording. But you can join us when you wake up, because we'll still be going. So in the afternoon, we'll have 3 sessions. You can see all of this online on the Armenian Institute website, or I hope you've received some material by email. Tomorrow we'll be hearing from Aram Kerovpian, Jacob Oli, Sevan Habib, Burcu Yıldız, Sylvia Alajaji, Alyssa Matthias, and Rick Adrians in the afternoon. And then in the evening, we have the pleasure of hearing Ara Dinkcan, Burcu Yıldız again, and Onur Günay, who will be talking about the wonderful film Garod. And we've asked you to watch Garod this week. Please do by tomorrow night, because it'll be a discussion about the making of that film. It's past, it's present, and it's actually how it's still playing out. So please do join us for all of tomorrow. I want to remind you that in the chat line somewhere, there is a feedback form. If you scroll around, you'll find it. We'd appreciate your filling that out. It's helpful to us to know what you're thinking, how we can improve, and also to show our donors. And speaking of which, it's fabulous if anybody can make a donation to the Armenian Institute. We can't do this without your help. It's again, it's that year of planning. It takes a lot of work to do these, and it's with great joy, I have to say, but some of it requires actual cash in hand. So if you can make donations, that's fantastic. I think that's really just about it. And so I will say, oh, there, Tatavika's put it back in the it's magically appeared. So we'll leave that there for a moment. And I will say thank you, and looking forward very much to seeing all of you tomorrow.